Warm greetings to everyone. I am Brooks Berndt, the Minister for Environmental Justice for the United Church of Christ. Glad to have everyone here for today's Creation Justice webinar, the webinar where we engage some of the most pressing matters faced by those seeking to be in the right relationship with God, God's creation, and all of our kin on this planetary home of ours. Today, we are fortunate enough to be able to take a deep dive into the waters of theology so that we might resurface renewed and re-energized for the work of creation justice. But before I introduce our special guest for today, Dr. Robyn Henderson-Espinoza, let me first turn things over to my co-host, the Reverend Malcom, pastor of Rush Memorial Church in Atlanta, executive director for Alabama Interfaith Power and Light and People's Justice Council. Help us think about this webinar for today, Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Brooks, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Robyn, for being with us today. I look forward to hearing from you. As I started doing my research beyond just the social media posts for Dr. Robyn Henderson-Espinoza, I was inspired by two words that really stood out to me. One was intersectionality, and the other was non-binary. And I thought to myself, what is my message for this justice space that I operate in? And I think that message is justice first. And this justice first is a slogan that was introduced by my mentor, Reverend Leo Woodbury. And it says that those who fight for justice should fight using intersectional analysis. In essence, pooling together our expertise as an intersectional or interdisciplinary team. It's Jennifer Nordstrom who states that there is not a single experience of the environment divorced from other relationships, or a single experience of humanity divorced from the environment. Rather, a variety of experiences are influenced by overarching patterns in society, and they intersect with each other, humans and non-humans' nature. I mean, what would it be like for communities of faith to become non-binary and intersectional as it relates to our issues of justice? I believe that it would look like community. I thought that this may have been a new concept until I remembered that there was a time that there was a tension between the Apostle Paul and the Church of Corinth due to Paul's preaching versus Apollo's preaching. You know, Paul goes on to say, I plant, Apollos waters, but God gives the increase. But I actually like the end part of that statement that says, we are all servants of God, working together. You are God's field and God's building. I think that this particular webinar will help us to see this intersectionality and non-binary form of justice. And again, I thank you and I look forward to hearing from you, Doc.
Terrific, Michael. Thank you for that framing for today's conversation. As I introduce Robyn, I also invite all of you to introduce yourself in the chat box. Tell us where you're from, your name, your pronouns, your place of worship. Get all that in the chat box so we can get to know you and see the many different places where our audience comes from. Now, for Dr. Robyn. Dr. Robyn is a rising theological star who has been named one of the 10 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress with a new book entitled Activist Theology. Dr. Robyn bridges the gap between academia and activism. And let me tell you, that requires an extraordinary level of intellectual flexibility and versatility. Dr. Robyn's new book is in the stores. I'll share a link to it. You will want to check it out after this webinar if you have not done so already. Without further ado, let me turn things over to our special guest. Go ahead, Robyn.
Thanks so much, y'all. It's really great to be here. And in addition to talking a little bit about the book, I want to talk about the relationship of activist theology to our other work in the world, particularly as it relates to our planetary concerns regarding climate change. I've been on a journey these last 5 years after finishing the PhD. I took a faculty post in Berkeley and taught there for a couple years, but then the 2016 election happened, and for many of us, it turned our world upside down, and it did for me. And I remember the night of the election, really thinking about my roots and the call to come home. I'm originally from northern Mexico, the Republic of Texas, and I had left Texas for graduate school. I went to seminary in Chicago and then the PhD in Colorado, and then moved further out west to what I'd be the queer utopia of the Bay Area in the San Francisco, Oakland area. And when I discovered that the Bay Area was not the place to be, and it was not a place for my roots to nourish, or even the fight that I wanted to fight, I moved home after the election and I landed in Nashville. A dear friend of mine said to me after I finished my PhD, Robyn, you just need to go hang out with real people. And, coming up through academia and being entrenched in what I call the self-perpetuating elitism of higher education, you're not around a lot of normal people. You're around people who read and write all the time, who are having a kind of conversation that isn't understandable to the public square. And during that time, when I was transitioning back to the South, I'd also years ago come out as trans and finally found the language of non-binary, knowing that I wanted to live in between the gender spectrum and to imagine a world that was larger than the gender binary. I kind of think that way about theology and ethics too, that there's something larger than Western thought. And as we think about the work that we need to be doing that should be grounded in an intersectional analysis, there's something larger than our local context. There's really a world that we need to partner with, people of all kinds, certainly non-human animals. So anyways, this language of non-binary, it fit me as a gender expression, but it also became a way about existing in the world as a public theologian, that there wasn't, that there shouldn't be a demarcation between what is academy and not academy, or what is the public and not the public, that we all should be invested in conversation, because my hope is that the work that the Activist Theology Project is doing is the work of collective liberation. And that means coming together with radically different people, doing the work of social justice from a place of bridging, not just bridging with the sameness that we can recognize, but really bridging from the points of radical difference. So that means racial difference, that means economic difference, that means housing difference, that means ideological difference, that means really building the kind of relationship that we need to have to do the work, to really save our work from the violence and destruction that empire and politics is creating. So I started writing this book, and the book took 3 years to make. And I often tell the story about how I turned in a draft of the book, and they wrote back to me and they said, "This is really great work, but this is not the book that we want. We want to know more about you." And so I spent a whole year rewriting the entire book from the place of story, because the previous draft was this high theory, 5 people could understand it if they were reading the discourse. And Fortress said, basically gave me the challenge to say, this is not it. You've not arrived. And it was a really humbling moment for me, because as much as I work in the public square of translating theory to praxis, I was still very much entrenched in this academic orientation of writing. And learning how to write for the public square and learning how to write for the church, because I really believe that my vocation is for both church and world, church and society, as a theologian. And so learning to write for the public square was a really, really humbling moment, and which really required me to get right with myself and all that is around me. And so I just started writing my story. I started writing my story of the questions that I hold, from being younger when my white father employed undocumented workers on his land, and really struggling with that reality and thinking theologically about what does it mean to employ undocumented workers and not a living wage. Like we're still doing that today. We're still, I mean, here in Nashville, the number of immigrant workers that we have are astounding, and they're often not paid at all. So there's a lot of wage theft. But if they are paid, it's not a living wage for them to have a home. So many of them are in shelters. So they work all day for these white serving elites doing gentrification work in the city. And then they're sleeping in shelters at night because they don't have enough to rent an apartment. So I really struggled with a lot of these questions that came from my own life and my own context. I'm born to a Mexican woman, not of this country, and that means that I straddle the relationship between race and power when it comes to, I heavily identify as a Mexican American, but I'm white passing. So I move in the world with power, access, and privilege. I'm also masculine of center, masculine presenting. And so how do I deal with these nodes of power that, when not dealt with in right ways, become very toxic? And so I wrote a book really about my story and the ways that I think theology should be mobilized, which I think is through activism and through acts of justice, and primarily that theology should be mobilized through storytelling. And so the Activist Theology Project was born about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And it's a nonprofit based in storytelling and companionship. And we're working to tell a different story about theology and ethics, one that actually works to create conditions for social healing. And so we're really invested in healing justice on a societal level. And we believe that the discipline of theology and ethics is a place where we can talk about social healing, how we can be in right relationship with one another and in right relationship with the world, and learn how to have a relationship of planetary concern with all that exists. The thing that I love about activist theology and its primary relationship to climate change and our planetary concern is that of relationality. I write about the kind of relationship that we should be in with one another. And it's a non-competitive relationship. What I mean by that is that we live in a world of toxic white masculinity that is killing certainly Black trans women and other trans people. But this toxicity of power is infused in all the relationships that we have with one another. It's why the white liberal progressive folks say Black Lives Matter without having an analysis of why it's important to say Black Lives Matter. You know, saying Black Lives Matter is a theological statement around a particular anthropological commitment to flesh that has been marginalized by empire. And so this is all about power and relationship. And when we get right in right relationship with ourselves and the world around us, we can begin to build bridges that are non-competitive, and we can build the kind of relationality that we need to have to really do the work in the world that I think that we're all called to do. So the Activist Theology Project is committed to that, and we primarily try to do that through different media, so through short film, through online courses, and a big place that we are wanting to establish is the role of embodiment and the role of the body in social healing. And so, I don't want folks to think that activist theology is just a thinking project or a thought project. Activist theology is about getting our hands dirty. It is about getting into the streets. It is about bringing people in and hosting people around the table, learning how to, it's hard to hate people over a good meal. That's what I always tell people. And so figuring out, how do we share meals? How do we get back to some of the basics of this work, which is sharing meals, which is hospitality, which is being in relationship with people. And so I spend a lot of my time traveling, speaking to different groups, churches. I never thought that becoming a theologian would mean that I would spend so much time in church, but I spend a lot of time in church preaching and a lot of accompaniment with folks, of just partnering with folks and helping them think and strategize on how to live out their vocation, which I'm deeply committed to. What I love about activist theology and our project is that we're committed to building the discourse. I think a lot of times when we see a new sort of theme come out of the academy, the discourse is built from an insular place of self-perpetuating elitism. And what I'm trying to do is build the discourse from the place of multiplicity. So for example, on our podcast, the Activist Theology podcast, we're going to have multiple voices on that podcast to help build the discourse. Because if you build it, if I just tried to build it on my own, then that's the danger of a single narrative. And we all know the danger of a single narrative capitulates to a type of power and toxicity that doesn't create conditions for social healing or collective liberation. And so activist theology really is a multi-node project that is working across lines of radical difference to really build the kind of world that we want to see. And we believe that takes a multiplicity of persons, that we believe that takes community. We're not trying to do it on our own. I'm not trying to do it on my own. I mean, I at festivals, for example, I will never give a talk on my own. I always do a talk with someone else, because I believe the conversation piece of having a conversation partner or having a co-presenter is about displacing the power that is often erected to put someone on a pedestal. And so I try my best to do collaboration as often as I can and as frequently as I can, because it disrupts that not only celebrity culture, but it disrupts the myth of the single narrative, or the danger of the single narrative, and it privileges collaboration, which is the final thing that I'll say about the Activist Theology Project. And really the book that was written is that our project is a deeply collaborative project. We try to be as flat as possible in terms of, we really want to be driven by consensus and togetherness. And we believe that if we can model the kind of work that we're trying to achieve in the world, just in our leadership with one another and our core team, then we can actually build the kind of world that we want to see. And so I think what that means is togetherness, or what I grew up hearing, which is somos en conjunto, which is we are together. We don't know how to actually be together in this fight. We all have opinions. We all are either silenced or canceled by one another. We actually don't know how to be together in the fight for social change, for social healing, for collective liberation. And so the Activist Theology Project, as a core team, we are deeply committed to togetherness, and a kind of togetherness that we really believe will shape the work and shape how we do the work through relationship. And so I think that that's what I'll say in terms of the Activist Theology Project. I certainly welcome comments and questions and ideas. And certainly if you want to be interested in the work that we're doing, you can sign up for our email list. We have a podcast that we're actually launching. We were doing 60 seconds of activism for a while, but we think that having more conversation instead of just 60 seconds is a better way to go. So we're relaunching our podcast, and there's a teaser trailer out right now. The first episode drops on Thursday. Our friends Delta Ray have given us their song Hands Dirty for us to use as part of the podcast, because we really want the work to be around getting our hands dirty with one another and with the world, so that we can see the kind of world that we want to inhabit. So I think I'll stop there. That's a lot of me talking, and would love to hear folks' questions, or if Brooks or Michael, if you have questions or want me to clarify for your community, I'm happy to do that. And then basically, I just want to be in conversation with y'all, because I believe the more time we can have together, the better world that we can build. And so you can sort of see in my pedagogical approach that togetherness is the way that I want to run with this. So I think I'll stop there, and I'll go for questions.
Great, thank you for that. If you want to ask a question of Robyn, you can type it into the Q&A box and we'll be able to see it there, or you can raise your hand. And I've also got a question I'm going to find here in a second that was emailed to me. Michael, do you have any conversation starters that you'd like to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So Robyn, again, I did have an opportunity to do some research prior to, just because I'm a fan.
Yeah.
But in my research, and you've expressed this term community, could you explain to us what community looks like for you?
Yeah, so I think about community from the place of the politics of radical difference. That community, certainly, I think we can see iterations of community where we all look alike. Maybe we have the same skin color, or we have the same educational background. But really, when I'm thinking about community, I'm thinking about a community of radical difference, which means we may not all look the same. We may not all live in the same neighborhood. But it's a term, it comes from the Latin, being in union with one another. And so when I think about community, how do we build the kind of relationship where we're in deep solidarity with one another? And my co-host on the podcast, we talked about community and solidarity and kinship with one another. And when we as an organization talk about community, and a community that is comprised of laborers for social healing, we are not talking about folks who look or sound the same. We're really looking at agents, humans, non-humans, coming together to be in deep solidarity. And I think that because we live in a world where we are all radically interconnected, both with human creatures, non-human creatures, and the world, that community has to look like, how do we not chop down every tree when we decide to gentrify a neighborhood? Because we actually need nature in order to survive. So how do we be in deep communion, in union, in deep solidarity with nature? And so I sort of have I'm a utopian thinker. And so I think sort of grand scale, and I may never see it in my lifetime. I may never see this achieved in my lifetime, but I believe in living my politics, because if we don't live our politics, then we're actually not being ethical agents in the world. And so community for me is the politics of radical difference.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I tend to have those same ideas, and I think I'm a utopian thinker as well, and tend to move in that vein. You spoke a lot about being anti. You talked about being anti-patriarchy, anti-racist, even anti-colonialism. Could you explain those terms and help us to, in particular, because I can't see the audience, but if I know the audience that usually shows up in this space is predominantly white
Yeah.
audience, and it's mainly clergy. How do
Yeah.
we be anti when it comes down to our preaching and teaching that helps move the masses that we actually influence?
Yeah. That's a great question, because and there's lots of terms being tossed around. How do you be multiracial, or how do you be anti-racist, or how do you be anti-white nationalist, or how do you privilege abolition? How do you be decolonial or anti-colonial? All of these terms are important. I want to say language is important. And what I mean when I talk about being anti-racist is, when we talk about race, it's assumed, it's been normalized that we're talking about white people. And so becoming anti-racist is a way of divesting from that kind of thinking and disrupting the norms. The same with anti-colonial. We live in an age of empire where the United States continues to expand in imperial ways. That's not the ways of Jesus. Jesus fought empire. He outfoxed the empire, and then was crucified by the empire. And so being anti-empire or anti-colonial is, I believe, in line with the Christian tradition. And we need to be real about our tradition. Our tradition had crusades that were colonial in nature, and that's part of our lineage as Christians. But I like to look at the stories collected about Jesus, and what did we learn how to be, or what kind of person did we learn how to be from the perspective of Jesus. And so that informs my language and my orientation of being anti-colonial. I do read a lot of folks like decolonial thought. So from the perspective of people of color who maybe have been marginalized because of colonial activity. And I think that we need to be invested in authors of color who write from a perspective that is different from ours. And so I look for language that helps create the relationship between becoming and being. We're socialized to be colonial, but how can we become anti-colonial?
Right. Okay. All right, we've got a couple of questions that have popped up. Susan Hendershot in the chat box says, Adrienne Marie Brown in her book Emergent Strategy talks about how those who work for justice are often busy throwing others working for justice under the bus, calling them out in public for mistakes, building a case for why people should listen to me and not them. I like your approach on the fallacy of the single narrative. Can you say more about how that approach can move us past the internal injustices that the justice movement perpetuates on itself?
Yeah, the justice movement is just as guilty of supremacy culture as what it fights against. And I love the work of Adrienne Marie Brown and her sister Autumn Brown. And I think that there are a lot of people who do exactly that, throw people under the bus. And, I think that what I try to do is I get really great invitations like this one right here to talk about my work. But what interests me is not just talking about me and in like putting myself up, but really talking about the kind of work that we can do together, because I'm not interested in capitulating to celebrity culture. And then to your question about, can I say more about how that approach can move us past the internal injustices that the justice movement perpetuates on itself? Yeah, we need to learn how to be in relationship with one another. And I think that, you know, we live in a culture and a justice environment where people, they think they have an idea, they say, well, I'm going to start an organization. The last thing I wanted to do was start a collaborative project. But I was only willing to do it if I was in deep community, deep conversation with other people. And it's actually being in conversation and relationship with white folks who are deeply invested in creating a different world is only why I'm willing to do it. And so I think what the justice community could be doing is not only reading things like Adrienne Maree Brown and listening to their podcast, but also learning to be in relationship across lines of radical difference. That actually might help us move to a different place in our work. It's why we at the Activist Theology Project are like, you want to come do work with us? Let's do it. Let's figure out how to make it happen. And we'll do everything we can to collaborate, because we really believe that collaboration and having a collective orientation will be the kind of work that we need to do.
Jeffrey Spencer asked, well, he said, Antiracism, Ibram Kendi's books, especially How to Be Anti-Racist, are very influential for him. Any thoughts about his approach to being anti-racist?
That is a great book. I really like that human. He's amazing. And we should be reading as much anti-racist work as we can. It takes a diversity of tactics. Everybody is going to have a different approach, a different pedagogical approach, different ideological approach. I like how Ibram does it. I think that we should be reading more of that kind of work. And we should be learning how even we got to the place where we have to read about anti-racism. We need to have a historical memory. For example, why is capitalism the way it is? Well, it's because they wouldn't abolish the economic system during the times of slavery and enslavement. That's why we are here where we are. So we don't have a historical memory in this country on why the disenfranchised are how they are and why there's such economic disparity. And so if we can do the work of the historical memory and actually help people understand why we got to where we are, which is what Activist Theology is trying to help folks do through storytelling, then we will understand why we need to read all of the anti-racism work that is available to us.
Right. We've got another question here from Laura. I'm so grateful to be hearing from and talking with Robyn. My question is this: the church, especially the UCC, but many others, is in a place of sameness. We gather with folks who share similar theologies to participate in rituals that are similar year to year, with folks who are mostly the same in race, ethnicity, gender identity, age, economic class. And all the time you are spending in churches, how are you talking about gathering across radical differences in these church spaces that are so homogeneous? And or can you say more about your ideas for action for decolonizing the white church?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's probably a question, and we don't have the time to to strategize, but it's the kind of question that we need to be asking, because so many of our communities look like one another, and so many of our communities act like one another. We need to get very real on the power of socialization and the power of white socialization. The reason why we have white churches and the white liberal church is because in part when people of color moved into cities, white folks left the city for the suburbs and began building segregated communities. White folks didn't want to be in relationship with people of color. And so we have to get, again, historical memory. We have to get real serious on how cities came to be and how suburbs came to be, and the role of economic supremacy in that, and the role of all the isms that plague us. I'm in churches a lot, and the churches that I'm in are mostly white, liberal, progressive churches. I grew up evangelical and still very, I still have an affinity for the evangelical tradition. I think they've got something in terms of how to be in community with one another. The white, liberal, progressive church has created a very insular community. And it's going to take a lot to break down those walls and decolonize that kind of church, but it's gonna have to be, I think, helping people feel called to action. And I think a lot of people within the white, liberal, progressive community don't feel called to action. They feel very comfortable in their pews or in their chairs that they're sitting in on each Sunday, and they'll give maybe to an organization, but there's no embodied action to their theology, which is why I talk about, if we want to be church in the world, we need to live our politics. I don't care what you believe. What I care about is how you act in the world, where you buy your groceries, how you treat the people who are begging for money on the streets. Are you volunteering your time to cook meals? I mean, it really is going to take all of us doing embodied action to build the kind of world that decolonizes and disrupts the homogeneity that is white serving.
Robyn, I'm going to break a little bit from reading off the other questions and ask a personal question. You spoke about storytelling, and I know in seminary I was taught about storytelling from the aspect of giving a sermon. But tell me, how is it an effective tool in the work that you do as an activist theologian?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think a lot of us are disconnected from our own stories. We read the news, we watch the 24-hour news cycle on CNN or MSNBC, and we actually don't know our own story. And I think one of the most powerful things that we can be doing as a community of justice-minded people is getting to know our own stories and actually finding out where in our stories are we capitulating to supremacy culture, and how do actually we re-narrate or restory ourselves so that we are in right relationship with one another and the world. So it's about getting to know yourself on a real deep level.
So is it the stories that you're telling yourself or the stories that you're hearing from others?
So it's both, right? Because we want to build empathy, and we want to build empathy to try to change the world, to try to change our communities, and getting to know ourselves through listening and telling stories is great theological work.
Okay.
Got a question from Wiley Cook. As someone who is in seminary being indoctrinated with communicating in academic theory, how does one actively learn to translate this high theory into language of the people? Or perhaps is that the issue? Do we just need to start with the people, like Latin American liberation theology?
That's a great question. It's hard for me to answer that question because I have 3 degrees in theology, and so I've read the tradition, and I've read the canon, and I've read continental philosophy, and I'm trained as a philosophical theologian. And so I have read all that and I love to read high theory, but you are right that not everyone knows how to translate. And I'll say that as a person who speaks both Spanish and English and who is often living in between 2 languages, a lot of times I feel lost in translation when I'm talking with people, because something I may convey in Spanish is not conveyable in English. And so, I grew up translating and learning to translate theory to action, or theology to praxis, is something that came because I was living in between Spanish and English. And so I would say certainly that starting with the people is great. And the academy is self-perpetuating elitism. In a lot of ways, the academy doesn't care about the people. And I say that way. And so frankly, because I've been in the academy and I still exist in the academy is not concerned with the public square. And so the work of activist theology is super concerned with the public square and with the people. If my work doesn't translate to the people, then I've got to rewrite it. I've got to redo it. And so that's why I think the power of story and empathy and restoring ourselves is the work that we need to be doing in our justice work. And I just want to say to the person who asked that question, seminary serves a particular function for credentialing. And I'm a non-institutional person as much as I can be. And I've also been credentialed by the academy. And it's learning to straddle the borderlands and learning when to pick your fight with the institution. And I'd be happy to talk offline about that if that person wants to reach out to me.
Peter Saltel asked, how does a community of radical difference shape the work that needs to be done for climate justice?
Yeah, so what's really great about building community of radical difference is its non-competitive nature. We need to remember that nature and the environment is at root non-competitive. It's going to happen whether or not we like it or not. And so we can learn a lot from the environment and from nature on how to be with one another. And so I would say that a core value of a community of radical difference is non-competitive. And that's a value that is shared with the environment and climate justice. I think the other thing that a community of radical difference, a core value, is learning to pay attention to that which has been marginalized. I think that when we come together across lines of difference, we actually learn to listen better to one another, and we can learn to listen to how we're harming our earth and our land, and we all have examples on how that is being done. I can look out my window right now and see 12 cranes in Nashville, and the pollution of all the construction and the displacement of land and the harming of land. That's not the kind of relationship I think that we need to be in with one another or with the environment. And so I would say that there are two core values. One is the non-competitive relationality, and the second is an active listening and a deep listening. We actually learn that we're in a community comprised of radical difference, committed to climate change, climate justice.
Rob, I wonder if you can help us paint out the picture of what you envision, in that, let's say we're working on relationships, we're sharing meals together, we're working on collaboration. How do we get then from there to a world beyond empire, realizing that, empire is what props up this destruction of the earth and drives climate change and so forth?
Yeah.
How do we make that?
Well, I mean, I think we need imagination, and we don't talk enough about imagination. Do we have the capacity to imagine the kind of world we want? Because it's going to, I work with 4 people at the Activist Theology Project. It's going to take more than 4 of us to build the kind of world. It's going to take me working and us working together to build the kind of world. But if we don't have an imagination of what that looks like, then we're just going to be spinning our wheels. And I think that part of the world that we want to create is where hospitality is valued, which is why I think sharing meals together is important. I think part of the world that we want to live in is where poverty is eradicated and everyone has a home. So we need to talk about economic justice, and we need to talk about how gentrification is displacing people. I read an article about Nashville. It costs $80,000 a year to live in Nashville, when most people only make 50 grand. So that means I'm not a math major or anything. I'm a theologian. I'm one trick pony, but there seems to be a deficit there of like 30 grand. So we need to come together with economic justice, with city planning, and with folks to imagine the kind of world. And if we start local, we can grow bigger. And if we can figure out how to create these pods of conversations in our local communities, we can build this network that is bridged together. And that's how we build a community of radical difference. That's how we imagine a different world. That's how we achieve moving beyond the empire.
So what suggestions do you have for those of us living and working across faith traditions in communities where non-Christians are a substantial population? And that came from Joy Barnett's.
That's a great question. The work of activist theology is, I try very hard not to come out as a Christian, because Christianity equals white supremacy right now. And I work very hard to work with my Muslim siblings, and those siblings who have different orientations, certainly no faith or atheist and agnostic. I think one of the most truest positions that I've had in my life is that of agnosticism, that I don't really know. And I think that that is our work, to build together across these lines of radical difference. And I think that when we can figure out how to put our beliefs aside and our ideology aside and just rely on the politics and how we are living in the world, there's something wonderful that happens when we live our politics, because we come into contact with people who are radically different than us, who maybe have different beliefs, but who are willing to join a fight because it matters to them. And so I would encourage folks to put aside belief systems and really have folks ask themselves, what are my politics? And do I share the same politics with my Muslim siblings or with my Buddhist brothers and sisters? And if I do, then let's join together in this fight to build a better world.
I think that goes back to you and that term you use about being non-binary.
Right.
And us being non-binary in our justice and our compassion.
It's a both and. It's got to be a both and.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that.
Robyn, you began your comments today by talking about the catalytic effect that the Trump election had on you.
Yeah.
And so I was just at a meeting the other night where the speaker began by saying, all right, it's 2020. That means it's go time. We've got an election coming up this year. So, I mean, what are you seeing and thinking, in this election year for people who are, concerned about the fate of our planet, who are concerned about the critical time that we live in as far as climate goes, climate justice, the critical issues faced, and the immense importance that this upcoming election has on so many different justice fronts. And so what are you feeling and thinking right now on that?
A lot, because all the campaigns are reaching out to me for my endorsement. And I think that we need to be very clear that we still live in a patriarchal world. And, I think about the sexism and misogyny that Elizabeth Warren is fighting against. And, I think, quite honestly, we should all throw our cards toward Warren, because she's fighting a fight against sexism, patriarchy, and misogyny. And we should be good feminists and be looking at what she's doing. I also think it takes a diversity of tactics, that we can't rely on the president to fix our problems, because we know that that's not how our system works. And so we need to be talking to our local, state legislators. We need to talk to our federal and national folks, and we need to be talking to the communities that are most impacted by the concerns that we have. You know, if we can figure out how to get you know, the carbon number to a place that is manageable. You know, I feel so concerned about our world, and we're so focused on the presidential election that I think we're losing sight of some on the ground work that we need to be doing. And so, you know, I have opinions about all the candidates, and I think that the last thing we need is an old white man in office, you know, and also I don't want another 4 years of Trump, you know, so it's complicated. I feel really sad that, with the exception of Andrew Yang, the people of color have suspended their campaigns. That tells us something about the electability and our orientation to candidates of color. We still have a race problem in this country that is fueling climate change. And when we get down to it, our planetary concerns all comes down to capitalism. And capitalism fuels racism. And, you know, we need to get serious on supremacy culture, which is why part of our work at the Activist Theology Project is launching curriculum on composting supremacy culture and helping people think through supremacy culture and get free and think differently so they can live their politics. So I have a lot of opinions about the presidential campaign, and also November 2020, there's a lot that needs to happen before November 2020, which means we need to build coalitions. We need to be deeply intersectional. We need to continue to fight. We can't rely on casting a vote in November 2020 for us to get free. That's just not how this works. And so we've got to continue to build the beloved community as often as we can and as frequent as we can through things like this, on conversation and storytelling and sharing insight.
Great. Thank you. Michael, do you have any further questions before we roll into calls to action and what we can do from here?
Well, actually, you know what, Brooks, I was thinking I'm going to turn my call to action segment back over to Robyn, because I'd like to hear from Dr. Robyn, what could we do as a community of faith to help further your work and the work of this radical difference in relation to our fight for environmental justice?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I love that question. And I think that, and I've already reached out to you, you know, on email. Basically, how do we build the kind of network that is going to help establish the kind of society? I mean, that's social healing. How do we build the necessary relationships to do the work? And so certainly I would love to hear from as many people who want to get on board with the work that we're doing. But you have to understand that the work that we're doing is the work of deep collaboration and collective with folks that be like us. We kind of world that's my call to action. Is we would love for you to join, but joining us means being a cog of folks and we're rooted in the South. And so I believe the South has the greatest political potential for change if we really harness the nation.
Great. Thank you for that, Robyn. I'm going to piggyback on that in a couple of ways, just to say that our next webinar, we will have some folks from the South, because we're going to be focusing on the most toxic places in the United States, whether it's Cancer Alley, whether it's Houston, whether it's Port Arthur. When you talk about toxic places in the United States, you're often talking about places that are in the South, places that have been called ground zero for the climate justice movement. And so, but that's what we'll be focused on in our next webinar. We're still putting together the pieces for that, so audience, stay tuned for that. And the other call to action, I'm going to echo, Michael and I are part of the UCC Council for Climate Justice. They've come out with a Kairos call to action. Digs into some liberation theology from South Africa and the United States, and puts that together and discerning what we need to be doing right now when it comes to addressing climate and inequality in the United States. So I'll put a link into that, just an opportunity for further theological reflection and discernment for everybody out there. Any closing words, Michael or Robyn, that you'd like to add to the conversation?
As I say every webinar, I'll say again, whatever you do, get involved. You don't come to these webinars just to listen. I believe you come to be encouraged to act. And so get involved. Remember what has been talked about today and that radical difference. And make sure that we are intentional about manifesting that. Thank you all for joining us. Dr. Robyn?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that I would add is I would love to hear from folks, and I agree with Michael that you're here to get involved, and so let's figure out how to get our hands dirty together and build the kind of world that we want to inhabit.
Well, thank you, Dr. Robyn. Applause all the way around for you today and your generosity in joining us. Great to be in conversation with you and to hear your message, encouraging us to work together collaboratively and with a spirit of hospitality. And so a much needed message, much appreciated. And we're glad that to be able to share this with our audience. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks so much.